Thank you, Una. Thank you, everyone, for being here this morning. So this is just the start of a much bigger conversation that we're going to have in the following days. I'm going to be talking about how we came across with this difficult challenge of collectively creating a new museum definition. As Una mentioned, I worked as co-chair between 2020 and 2022. Actually, we are still co-chairing, myself and my colleague Laurent Bonilla-Murchev from Costa Rica. We're co-chairing still the Standing Committee for the Museum Definition. Now we're getting into the implementation process and talking with national committees about translations and implementation, for instance. So I'm going to be talking about what happened in the past 2 years and what are the main changes in this new definition. Here is the definition that you probably already know. I know that several of you perhaps have participated throughout the process, the collaborative process of creating it. I know that the National Committee, actually the national committees of the different countries here represented might have been involved to some extent. As you can see in this text, this very short text that now is in the ICOM status, the blue terms are the terms that have been introduced for the first time in the definition. They are the significant changes in this definition. I will comment on these terms further ahead in this presentation, but most importantly, you can see that the shape of the definition is changed. It has expanded a little bit. It has 3 sentences now, and it presents some new concepts that are probably reflecting the practice in your own institutions, and I'll be looking forward to hear about that in the workshops. But now I will talk a little bit about the challenge of creating it, how we conceived it, and how much participation it was involved in throughout this process. First of all, I like to start with this image because when you think about museums, this is where our mind automatically goes. And I could even say this is an image from the 19th century representing the Louvre, which is the most traditional imaginary of a museum that we have. And if we think about maybe even in the middle of the 20th century, when we thought about museums, this was the most representative image that we could have. And ICOM started thinking about the definition of museum in the 50s, and then in the 60s, there was the most prominent one, the first one that was really implemented in its statutes. So back then, not only ICOM was a much smaller council, basically populated by museum directors from Europe, so we could see that this was the museum that ICOM was representing. But not only that, it was a very traditional idea and a very objective idea that was centered in collections. We could say that it is a museum with a very restricted audience, belonging to a specific class with a specific race or ethnicity, and that's what we can see in this image. But when you think about the 21st century, in the 21st century, this is also a museum. This is the Museum of Removals. It is a community-based museum in Rio de Janeiro, where I come from, in Brazil. This museum was created in 2016, and it is a response from this community that was threatened to be removed from the periphery of the city during the reforms that were done due to the Olympic Games in 2016. So this community that was basically destroyed between 14 and 16, they decided to create a museum in the memory of the destruction. This museum has no collections. This museum is basically what you can see in this picture. It's a group of people talking about the history of gentrification. And the collections, if we may say, are the photographs that were produced by the community to denounce state action against them. So this is also a museum. And the Louvre is also a museum. So how can you conceive a single definition? And if we talk about museums in your country, like in your multiple countries, like we're going to do this afternoon, we'll also see the diversity of experiences that can identify as museums. So what I'm trying to say here is that we had a very big challenge with this definition in 2020 when we started this process. Obviously, as Francois demonstrated, the process is much longer. There were several rounds and several periods in the history of ICOM where the definition was discussed, but the last definition that we had was from 2007, and it created some elements that are still there, but it was still a definition marked by values from the 20th century, where even ICOM was not that diverse or representative of multiple ideas of the museum. Here we have some of the results. This is just to show you a little bit the complexity of the process. This is after already 3 rounds of consultation, of global consultation with ICON members, non-members, professionals from every country that we could reach throughout this process. And that's something that we reached before we started drafting the definitions. As you can see, there are multiple dimensions. There are terms that intersect. There are terms that belong to different dimensions. So how could we not only count the terms that valued, but also interpret them in a way that they could be used in a definition? That's how we did it. In a very simplified way. I'm not going to get into the details of the process because the time here wouldn't allow, but we created this methodology that is a methodology of 12 steps that lasted 18 months, actually a little bit longer if you count the Prague conference, but actually we started it in December. We launched this in December of 2020, as you can remember, probably in the middle of the pandemic, so most of the process was online. And after many months, we did 4 big rounds of global consultation, which means that 4 times, and even 5 times if we count the final vote in Prague, we allowed members of different committees of ICOM, international committees, national committees, regional alliances, and affiliated organizations to talk about what they thought should be in the definition, and then to vote for the best definition that suited them. And that's how we arrived at the Prague conference with one single definition to present to ICOM. So here are just some numbers to really summarize what we did. So there were 5 rounds, again, of global consultations that lasted 18 months. In the second consultation, when we actually asked for the building blocks of this definition, we gathered 2,085 terms or concepts that were reviewed. They were received either in English, in Spanish, or in French, because those were the 3 official languages of ICOM. Then we have a very high participation rate, actually 70.3% of ICON representatives participated in at least one of the rounds of consultation. For us, this was a big achievement because when we looked back into the history of ICON, most consultation processes had around 30% of participation. They were never above 30, and we got 70. So this really showed how much people were interested in the process of this definition. So 126 committees, which means this 70%. And if we only count ICON committees, because affiliated organizations are outside ICOM, we could even count 76% of participation, which involved 86 countries, more than 200 hours of Zoom meetings that happened throughout the pandemic, over 50 webinars that were organized in different countries, in different regions, thanks to the participation of national committees and, of course, regional alliances. After that, we arrived in Prague with a certain amount of confidence that people actually supported that definition. And finally, we got the approval of 92.4% of the votes, which was really nice. So this means that even though we might not agree with the definition completely, we might have our reservations, but it really represents what the professional community of ICOM, and even externally to ICOM, because many external non-members participated throughout this process, really see themselves represented in this definition. It's something that we have as our common agreement on how we can define museums in the 21st century. This is just a little bit about the representation rate within ICOM. In the first chart, you can see how ICOM is distributed. Obviously, the majority of committees come from Europe, but in this case of the definition, we kept a balance. So we don't really have a higher participation of any specific region in the world, even though Europe is 39%, 49%, it was represented in the responses as 40% of the responses. And for instance, Latin America, which constitutes 16% of ICOM, actually participated as 21% of the responses, which means that there was an increase in the participation of Latin American communities. Unfortunately, a not so high participation of African committees or Asian committees from Asia and the Pacific. But this is very balanced in our point of view. Now I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the terms that constitute this definition. This was one of the first charts that we got after the second consultation, where committees presented us with a bunch of terms. Each committee had the chance to propose 20 terms and descriptions in our project. And in the first round of when we looked into these terms, as you can see here, we have the top 20, which are a balance, once again, between old terms that were already there in the 2007 definition, but also some new terms. The ones in yellow are the terms that have been introduced into this new round of consultation. So we already saw that even though this definition was changing, some of the things that were there before needed to actually be kept because they were so important for ICON members. And one example of that are the actions, or we could say functions of museums. This was very structural to the definition throughout the time, and these were kept. So we can see here, for example, collection or acquiring, as in the old definition, conservation, preservation, research, but also display or exhibit and communication, which is very much close to what Francois was referring before as the PCR model proposed by Peter Vermensch, when preservation, research, and communication were considered as the three pillars of museums' functions. And this is very much, if we go back in history, this is very much related to Stransky's ideas on musealization, or Jan Jelinek, when in the 60s is already trying to think about what are the functions, what are the basic actions that museums do. So this was not changed. There was some slight differences, like acquisition was replaced by collection, and I will be talking about that later. Communication, there was a discussion between communication and interpretation, but basically we can say that the functions stayed the same. The structure of the definition also evolved a little bit, but at the same time, it kept the basics, because throughout time, when we look into the evolution of the definition in ICOM, we have at least these three elements that are always there: the meaning, the basic functions, and the purposes or values. So for example, when you look into some of the examples of definitions, such as the one from 2007, we can say that in terms of meaning, museums were described as a permanent institution. Before, they were described as establishments, which has to do with the French translation, and it was understood as institution, open to the public, not for profit. These are meanings. But also we have the basic functions, as I mentioned before: conserving, researching or studying, communicating or interpreting and exhibiting. And then the purposes: in the service of society, which was a phrase introduced in '74, very much influenced by the Round Table of Santiago de Chile from '72, and also for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment, as it was phrased in the 2007 definition. So these were the basic functions before, and now, through our research, we achieved this more complex composition of dimensions, what we call dimensions, which actually keeps the essence of the previous structure, but now it changes a little bit, expands a little bit. So we still have the entity, which is related to the meaning, what is the museum, or the entity qualifier, what kind of museum it is. We have the actions, but also the objects in which museums act, or with which museums act. And then we have in the third column here some new elements. For example, what kind of experience museums offer. Also the targets with whom or for whom museums operate and communicate. And then finally, the values and issues. Values and issues were a big discussions, because maybe you already know that, but in 2019, when there was a very controversial debate in Kyoto, in the conference of Kyoto about the definition, a lot of people raised the question, okay, but should the definition state values or be like a mission statement? And so that's something that concerned us in the beginning of this process. And when we did our consultations, 96% of the data, of the responses, actually included some values. So most of people actually believed that the definition should not just be operational, but also in a certain way, aspirational. And so that's how we got to this museum definition. Some terms that we should consider, and now we are in this stage where we're thinking about the terms, and we have a lot of data, so beyond this short definition, we have a lot of material that has been gathered, and so it makes us think about what kind of terms are there and what are the meaning of these terms. I would just like to start with some of the terms that refer to what a museum is, which is, for example, institution. Institution was a term that we wouldn't discuss much because it received 80% of support. So it's the rate of proposals of support of this term, especially in consultation 3. As you can see, institution got 80% and space was 11%. So there was a huge jump, which means that people wanted this term there. And some people questioned, but institution, isn't it too traditional? Yes, in fact, commonly we can say that institution is a term that refers to the most traditional form of museums. But when we think about this notion in sociological terms, institutions can also mean a set of customs or shared agreement within societies. For example, the church is an institution, universities are institutions, marriage is an institution. So what's the problem of calling museums an institution if we agreed on it? And a definition is also an agreement. But also there are other terms that caused a lot of debates. For example, not-for-profit. We know that in some countries there are museums that call themselves museums and they are for-profit. There was first a slight change because the old definition said non-profit, and we consulted with legal, and there was a problem with non-profit because in some Anglo-Saxon countries, such as the United States, non-profit is a very specific legal kind of institution. So not all museums are non-profit. So we needed to go for not-for-profit, which means that museums should not aim for profit, and any resources they get, any income, should be reinvested in the museum. It's not that museums shouldn't make money. They should, but they should reinvest. They shouldn't have stakeholders, for instance. So this is just a conception that we have, and that it's very important for ICOM. But we know that there are a diversity of management models, and that's something that obviously we'll be discussing also in the next few days. There was also an issue with the term permanent. A lot of people said, well, nothing is permanent. Nothing is supposed to last forever. So how can we say that museums are permanent institutions? So again, we had to talk with legal advisors. And one of the things that were pointed out to us was that permanent is actually legally, can mean mostly, it refers to the fact that something lasts in time. So we could say that the perennial nature of such entities, of institutions, which are meant to endure within a specific social and judicial framework. There's also a political acception of this term, which allows museums in a constantly changing world to claim for long-term sustainability and maintenance. In the beginning, I have to say, I had questions about these terms, but then I come from Brazil, and in Brazil there are many museums that don't have enough funds to be open all the time, especially community museums and smaller museums. And when we have a definition that states that museums should be permanent institutions, it really means that these smaller museums can actually ask for support and say, look, if we are museums, we should keep our doors open and we should have resources for that. So it's also in its strategic term in certain contexts of the world. Also, we have, in terms of the big functions or actions of museums, research was the one that received more vote, it was more strongly represented in the data. But when we talk about research, we don't necessarily need to see that museums have to have scientists working with them. We can think about research in different ways. We can think about research from the community, research with different methodologies of sharing of knowledge. And here, for example, we have the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, which is a community-based museum that actually is contesting the history, the official history of a neighborhood in this African country, where in order to contest official history, you need to find different kinds of ways of doing research. So research is an important term, but it can be understood in different ways, as well as collects. And there was also a big discussion between not saying acquire, especially for some European countries. Acquisition is a very important word, but acquisition actually has a legal imposition of something that belongs to the museum. So if a museum acquires something in some countries, it legally means that it needs to become national heritage. It needs to be a permanent collection. And some museums are not concerned with constituting permanent collections. Some museums can collect in different ways. For example, here we have the Museum of Identity and Pride in Costa Rica, which is a museum that collects oral history about the LGBT movement and living and way of life. So this is a collection, but it's not necessarily the result of an acquisition. It's much more a result of a research. So there is this difference. So in this case, our data showed that for most of the ICON representatives, collecting was perceived as a broader term rather than acquiring, which is very much specific and legally bound. Another term that was introduced and that's associated with communicating, but not quite the same thing, is interpretation, or interprets, as one of the museum's actions. We can say that museums today are not just communicating heritage. Museums are actually creating something new with the collections that they have, with the knowledge that they have accumulated, and with the research that they do. So the reason why museums are constantly researching is because collections can be interpreted in different ways. Some museums are not recollecting, but they are recreating narrative from the collections that they already have. This is an example with this famous exhibition at Musée d'Orsay, which is about the black model in 19th century art, where the museum conducted a new big project of research about the black models in paintings, where they were actually recreating the stories of these individuals that were represented sometimes without a name, sometimes without a personal history, and the museum was actually restituting them with names, functions, places of birth. So this means that it's a new way of presenting something that the audience already knows. So museums are constantly interpreting and reinterpreting. Another important word, actually two words that were very important in our data, were accessibility, or accessible, and inclusive. We know that these words are somehow connected, but they don't necessarily mean the same thing. And there was a big discussion if the definition was already saying that museums are open to the public, shouldn't it be enough? But then we understood that being accessible is much more than being open to the public, and actually being inclusive is even more than that. But these words can be interpreted in different ways in different countries and contexts. So, for example, accessibility may mean to be accessible to specific audiences with limitations or with disabilities, but it can also mean like creating new ways of communicating to the public. For example, museums using social media. Here we have several examples, or museums creating websites that are actually edutainment sites where they can educate and communicate through entertainment. And also being inclusive as something that is attached to accessibility, but it goes beyond that, because it implies that museums should be welcoming to all, but also preparing itself to receive and serve any of all kinds of visitors. For example, here we have the Pinacoteca of São Paulo in Brazil that in 2014 launched a program that's called Plural, which is a program that involves especially people who live on the streets, who are extra a mural from the museum. It's a museum that is located in a very bad periphery where there is a lot of people living in the streets, and they are actually establishing a relationship with this audience, which is also an audience, even though they have been ignored by the museum for several years. So this is one, I mean, it means that it's not just having the door open, but actually reaching out to people and making people feel that they belong to these specific spaces. So we have a lot of important values that have been introduced in this definition. So for example, diversity is an important value, and we can say that we can also interpret diversity in different ways. Here, for example, we have an exhibition at MoMA that was focusing on specific artists, African-American artists that have been ignored in art history for a long time. So they are rethinking, again, here we can definitely intersect diversity with interpretation, because they are rethinking collections and reinterpreting the history of art by including artists that have been erased or not really considered in the history or in the collection of the museum. So this is an example of diversity. But we can also say that museums can be diverse in their shape, or in the way they function, or in the way they communicate with communities. For example, here, the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, which is more like a cultural center for art. It's a museum completely based in the work with communities. So it's also diverse in the sense that how they're practicing the museum's core functions is different from other institutions. But diversity can also have to do with how museums are communicating in their exhibitions. When we talk about diversity, it's not just the diversity of the audience, but also the diversity of the museum itself, how it is presented, what kind of language, also the diversity of staff, who actually is included in the museum work. And another important value is sustainability, even though, again, this can be understood in different ways in different countries. Here, for example, I bring an example from Brazil, which is an eco-museum in Amazonia. And this eco-museum deals with sustainability much related to social sustainability, like involving communities in specific practices that are also related with the preservation of the environment. It is a museum in the Amazon, very close to the Amazon rainforest. But when we look into more traditional acceptions of museums, we can think about that many museums, and specifically science museums, are much more concerned with environmental sustainability, thinking about how museums can be more proactive in terms of creating a sustainable mindset in the preservation of the environment. We could even talk about economic sustainability, thinking about how museums can be sustainable in their management conceptions. In terms of the hows, of how museums operate and communicate, we have some important keywords there. For example, we say that museums should operate ethically. This is the first time that a definition actually explicitly say ethical and ethically as a value for museums. It has a lot to do with the fact that this definition is also instrumental to the ICOM Code of Ethics, which is now being rediscussed and reconsidered. But ethically can also mean how museum will operate in terms of creating specific rules or basic guidelines to work considering communities, considering different peoples. For example, in the processes of restitution and repatriation, museums need to operate ethically, but also professionally. And this is a way to put this element like in the same sentence to show that they are equally important. Museums need to be professional or to operate professionally. But when you talk about professionally, it's not necessarily that museums need to ask people to have a degree. Everybody who works in museums needs to have a degree or a professional specialization. It can be perceived in different ways. For example, we received something from the National Committee of New Zealand, where they were presenting to us this indigenous knowledge of kaitiakitanga, which means in the Maori language, caring for collections, the practice of being a caregiver or a guardian. Some museums in New Zealand are actually introducing this concept as part of the profession, as part of the professionals that need to work in this museum. I'm just about to finish. The participation of communities is actually a very important element, and now I think one thing that this definition brings to the table is the fact that we don't necessarily have community museums separated from traditional museums. Actually, all museums should be engaged with communities, and most of museums' practices are dependent on this community engagement. Here, an example of a museum in Colombia that actually is rethinking their collections to talk about a crisis with LGBTQ victims of the country's armed conflict. Another element, varied experiences. I think this really opens up to several experiences that museums may create. So this is a very open definition in the sense that we know today that some museums will foster activism and will actually be much more engaged with societal issues. Some museums will actually create experiences of engagement in different kinds. There's a museum in Japan, a community-based museum in Japan, where the audience can actually interact with what is being created in terms of intangible heritage. Some museums propose like leisure experiences. This is an activity in a museum, the Rubin Art Museum in New York, where visitors can actually spend the night in the museum. Another important word is education. I'm not going to get into much details because I know this is a big term that's been discussed within ICOM, especially in the Committee of Cultural Action and Education. But here you can see how education appeared in our research with other terms that are important, such as knowledge, share, learning, and enrich. So one thing that we understood from that is now education is being perceived not as an unilateral process, but as something that needs to be built with the audiences in a very horizontal way. Reflection or critical reflection, that is something that many museums are actually taking as an important result of their actions. For example, here we have Fred Wilson installation or reinterpretation of a collection in the Mining the Museum intervention, where a lot of important elements of the 18th and 19th century are now putting side by side with elements of slavery that tells the story of slavery. So this is an important example, and many museums are now playing with collections in order to raise reflections that the audiences are not used to have. And finally, knowledge sharing, which is also, we could say it is a value, but it's also how museums are now creating meaning. It's not just a curator defining what museums are going to do or defining the labels for a collection. We are seeing many museums engaging in processes of collaboration with audiences, and I'll be talking a lot more about that tomorrow. But here we have a couple of examples. This is the Maasai Living Cultures project in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. It started in 2020, but it's still ongoing. And it's one of those examples where museums try to decolonize, not only by restituting, but actually by recreating their own processes and recreating labels and interpretation of collections. This is also another example in Rio, where a sacred collection is being preserved by the National Museum, the Museum of the Republic, and this museum has no knowledge about these religions, so they brought the religious community, it's an African diasporic community within the museum to work with the conservators and museologists. So, a lot of new things in this definition. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of fun discussing them in the next few sessions, but I will also look forward to hear from you and to learn from your own experience in the Baltic region. Thank you very much.